When James was sent to the school at 10, he had no interest in studies. In fact, he was sent home from the school ultimately as someone who they didn't feel they could. The idea of the school was to train someone in a craft that they could take on for the rest of their life. That's probably where he may have learned some of the sewing, there's a printing press at the school, some of the kind of basic crafts that he uses in the art, he may have picked up at that place.
He had an older sister who was deaf. She was at the Gooding School. They were deaf for different reasons. But she was 8 years older and she was at the school. So the family, we'll probably never know why a decision was made not to even put him into school until the age of 10, at which point he had already kind of lost out on language.
There's some speculation that the school started in Boise and then it possibly burned down and then moved to where it was now. So a lot of the records were lost. In fact, the discovery of his name in the folder no one had made that discovery before. That was new information that we actually proved that he was there as long as he was.
Complex feeling of the deaf school as being an oppressive place at that time, but also it was community. You were with people who were like you and you could communicate with them and there was shared experience. So I see that all over in the drawings. Those two colored that you meant, those are the images of the deaf kids going off to school, being dropped off by their parent, which is a deeply emotionally resonant memory in most deaf people's lives, both positive and negative, charged. So I see that very much in the school drawings. Castle himself was a curator. It wasn't just that he was an artist, but he also curated and took great care of his art, which is partly why we have it today, because the bundling thing that he did, he bundled all of his own art into bundles and stored them into the shed or the attic. And apparently the story was it's not just that he bundled and then put it there and left it. He would bundle and then later he'd come back and he'd undo the bundle, sort it all back out and add in new pieces.
James used to stick the bundles in behind the wood in the barn, and the barn was flooding, and he and his sister went out and saved all the work.
Soot and spit, that's how they're coded, soot and saliva, but they're typically called soot and spit drawing, are a big body of the work. They're a body that is, I think, highly valued in the art world overall. So the exhibit has a fair amount of those in it. But in the school drawing, there's just so much that really is grounded in how the schools really were during that time. You see, there's one drawing that shows the kids being drilled in oral lessons. Like I said, you see the kids without arms. You see the prominence on male hearing teachers, which is what happened after 1900. The schools all really became taught and run by hearing men. And before 1900, they weren't actually deaf people were teaching in the schools. So you see that kind of accuracy. And then it moves to the print material. So there's a case that shows just a little bit of the variety of the print material. When Castle was first discovered and brought out, the art world was most interested in the print material in the books because that was it. He was a guy who's deaf and dumb. He was declared illiterate, but he's making all these books. But it was one of the trades, the primary trades that they learned at the deaf school.
One of the things he used to do is he'd take two pieces of broken glass and put them together and look up at the sun with them to create the obvious prism effects. And he'd call the nieces and nephews out with him. And they would just lie in the field doing that together.
Castle loved kaleidoscopes. He took great delight in them. And I see much of his work as kaleidoscopic in that sense that it's kind of never ending, but also in that with a kaleidoscope you get an image and you hold the image, you look at it all pretty, and then if you bump it a little bit, you get a whole new image, but really it's kind of like the same other image. There's some closest, and that's his work over and over again.
are probably friends of his that he would talk to, and it was good. It's always good to have somebody to talk to, isn't it? It's good to have friends. Yeah, I've got a door on the left here.
And then like storage on top.
And storage. Very good. I think it's easier to tell that this person has shoes, right? You know what we think? We think that this is the artist. We think that's James Castle. And we think that because this is the way he always wore the same kinds of clothes. He wore overalls. And he's wearing these overalls. And we think that that's a picture of him. Is we are going to make friends. And if we have time left over, we're going to make something for them. And I'm going to show you how to do it. Scraps of magazines and cardboard. And then I added this decoration here just because I like the pattern. I wanted the pants to be a little bit more fun. Yeah, this I think is a poinsettia. So every chance I get to make a cat, and so this cat is kind of just like my real cat. Her name is Vanilla P. She's all black and she's a little cat. And the only difference though is Penelope doesn't have words written. I don't think she would like that. Yeah. You could make a friend for your friend if you had enough time. I like that.
In deaf literature, in sign language literature, there's a deep mythology around doors. Doors appear everywhere in the deaf storytelling canon. So we think about doors as opportunity knocks, or something on the other side, but it's much more mysterious in deaf people not being able to see through the door pane, because I didn't hear them come trudging down the hall. There was nothing that clued me in, and suddenly, poof, there they are, and I've been deeply immersed in something, and so that it's always a startle. Kind of vibrancy that happens, a mystery with all of his doors. That's kind of the same thing with human faces, like a mystery to the human faces, and trying to figure them out.
I find the most interesting things about James Castle's work are that he worked simultaneously his whole life on several different forms and styles simultaneously. Usually artists work in one style for a longer period. I think it would only be in a rural upbringing that his family would have the general store and the post office for his rural farming community in their house. I think that is very important because all the mail and all the junk mail was given to James. What makes James Castle very distinctive is that for his whole life, he only worked on found materials, paper, cardboard, making a charcoal wash out of saliva and soot. He never used a brush. He only used sticks that he would sharpen, walnut shells, peach pits, those type of things for actually carrying the paint onto the paper. He looked back to his experiences in the deaf school, and both visually and according to what he learned there, and how that influenced his art. He was most likely taught tailoring, which matters a great deal in his constructions that he made. He probably studied carpentry or furniture making, which also is reflected in his constructions. And most likely he also studied printing. At the deaf school they had a printing press, and so his fascination with the printed word and with how the printed word is set up on the page greatly influenced all of his letter and word compositions.
You know, a problem with artists is there's this idea that artists are either good or bad, and that isn't the way anything works. You know, if you're a good writer, there are things that you write that are bad, and if you're a good artist, there are things that you draw that are bad, and this is one of them. So he suddenly went from nothing to everything, to this is worthless, that's worthless, everything in here is worthless, to now everything in here is the best thing in the world, or valuable. You know, there is value to it, but it isn't a good work. And so just the way that it's treated, that it's like, no, this person's a nobody. Okay, I'm sold, everything they did is good. Picasso's an example of that, right? With Castle, I think in that sense, his disability has to have mattered. And he talks about it in his work. I mean, when you look at his work, you can see that he's talking about things that pertain to his education as a deaf person, his communication with other people, or the lack thereof. There's tons of visual cues in his work that's important.
That it's not just, a beautiful picture. There's meaning and value and content in his messaging, and also this sort of full documentation of his life.
Do you think he intentionally chose not to pass? Because I mean, well, like, so my
I've never thought about originating it that way.
Well, my step-grandmother is a first-generation Mexican-American, and she pretends to not know English, but she lived here in my childhood. I remember she lived here for 30 or 40 years, and she would suddenly know English. You would be talking about something, and all of a sudden she picked up on it real quick, and then the rest of the time she pretended that she didn't, and she used that, I think, intentionally. It was an intentional way of not having to get brought into conversations that she didn't want to be a part of.
Maybe you don't have to have words to have a relationship. Maybe you don't need sign language for a relationship. Maybe it's based upon our behaviors, our actions. Maybe there was a language and it was body language, and body language is more powerful than we realize. Do we need to have words to tell us that a person loves us? But this is very profound, and it's a good reminder of what we mean by relationships and family dynamics.
He was treated as a person who couldn't do things that other people could do. And it meant, to those people, I think it meant that he was less of a person than they were.
Seems to be purposely subverting ideas about certain things, about text, about literacy, about, you know, people's opinions about him being dumb or not dumb.
One of the things with Castle and with many of these artists is there's myths that form around the story.
We don't know what they meant. We aren't able to ask him what they meant.
How we engage with Castle tells us more about us and who we are.
The basic human connections that didn't require language.
There's just so much mystery about Castle. You know, as an artist that no one ever interviewed, no one never ever asked him about why he made this or used this material, because he was enough outside of language. It didn't happen. So every time we encounter Castle, we're constructing him.
And it's a good lesson for us. And we can see how powerful art can be.